What's exciting about that is how it's going.
Good morning, not really. I'm representing I've sat back there occasionally here over the last 6 years, but no.
All right, good morning, everybody. I think we've waited as long as we can for the stuff our board members. So I hope others are going to be trickling in. My name is Mark Elliott. I'm Vice Chair of the Development Board. I'll be carrying today's session in our shed. It's good to see everyone here today. I think it's going to be a really looking forward to today's discussion. We're going to be talking a lot about domestic workers, a topic we haven't really dealt with here before, and I think we're sure to learn a lot and have a chance to think a little bit about what the board might do to address some of the things that are brought up. I want to acknowledge Debbie King is here, but oh, here she is. She just stepped away from sitting at the table. She's usually at the table. Former board member, who's a volunteer with the National Domestic Workers Alliance. So welcome.
I'm actually on staff.
On staff? Oh, I was misinformed. Crack staff. Just that. Don't worry. So, do we have a forum for?
One short.
One short. So we are not going to take care of any board business. And so I'm going to turn it over to Reynold, who's going to give us an update on the Summer Youth Internship Campaign.
Okay, thanks, Mark. So before I begin, I'm going to hand out what you see on the screen here to folks.
Can everybody, am I correct?
Yeah.
With lenses, I have a little trouble seeing this. I don't know if you can dim the lights a little, that would help anybody else.
Yeah, we're going to head, it's going to come around to the board members if you can't see it on the screen. So I'll just provide a brief update regarding the board's Summer Youth Internship Program, our internship campaign. So just as a reminder, the campaign's efforts support the city's Summer Youth Internship Program, which include Vladeck-related Summer Youth Employment programs. So members can participate in one of three ways: employ a young person at their organization, make a financial contribution to support an internship slot, or connect someone in a network to the program. And so as of December of last year, the board launched the 2018 campaign with the goal to secure 300 internship slots, not including a contribution from city which participated, and a minimum of 12 private sector slots per board member. In addition, the board members committed to contacting 12 private sector businesses in their networks to encourage them to hire an intern. And so with the official start of the programs in about a month, we are nearing the end of our campaign. And I just want to note what you see here in front of you are commitments at this point, meaning that we only recorded the numbers, the employers who have submitted their worksite agreement with NYC. So there are some pledges that still are outstanding. Some folks have indicated they're interested in hiring, but haven't yet submitted their worksite agreement. And we will report the final numbers at the next meeting in October. So as of today, the board has collectively secured 802 internship slots for the summer. A large portion of that being city's contribution, which totals 650 slots. So without city's contribution, the board has secured 152 slots. And I should mention that the goal the board set was, again, not including city's contribution, so it was 300. And so we've fallen short of the goal, not including city's contribution. And last year, the board secured 239 slots without the city's contribution. So just to summarize a little bit what you see here again, so in total, we've had 15 out of the possible 23 members participate, meaning that they've recorded at least one business contact or secured at least one internship slot. And we look forward to next summer. The board, hopefully we can look forward to figuring out how we can improve the campaign and set an appropriate goal for next year. But now I'll open up for brief questions and any comments that folks may have.
Well, I believe we also sent a check. Did you get it, or just want to make sure?
Yes, that's included here. Yes. Thanks, George.
Are we still accept checks in, or is it closed? Or will we still accept checks?
We're never closed to accepting checks.
Yes.
Okay, I got my answer.
Yeah, I believe that's still a possibility.
Ralph, do we know the breakdown between the ladder for leaders and the regular summer youth in terms of these pledges?
I don't have that in front of me at the moment, but the vast majority of them, in terms of folks who have been hired, are typically SYP.
They are.
Yeah.
Because that's city. The city does SYEP as opposed to ladders.
Well, the city is a financial contribution that supports ladders for leaders.
Oh, it's ladders for leaders.
Yes.
Oh, so that's got to be the majority of ladders overall. Okay. Well, city, yeah. I'll mean it's everybody.
So Reynold,
Sure.
I guess a question or a thought for me is, for those that have done it in the past, I guess what keeps those organizations from kind of it becoming a regular routine where they do it every year and they consider it just kind of part of their regular schedule of hiring? Because I guess as an organization, if we were kind of trying to increase it each year, that would be great if we had this starting baseline. But instead, it feels a little bit more like we're recreating it and redoing it every year. So I guess any thoughts around that we can work towards, right? Work towards improvement.
Is the question like what keeps people coming back essentially? If they are
Right, so what's keeping an organization from, right, each year saying, well, we did 3 last year, of course, we're doing 3 this year, and so on.
Yeah, I don't know if folks have any, want to share their experiences.
So I can just tell you from experience, we have a large group of core partners that have been with us for many, many years, and they participate year after year. The level of participation may change year to year, especially if they're paying directly because of funding. Another issue that we find is we are successful at companies where we have an ambassador, someone who believes in the program and can really shepherd the process and get everyone on board at their organization, and obviously there's turnover. So year to year, we may have a very committed partner who has been with us, but our ambassador has left, has moved on, there's been a reorganization, and so we're back at square one, reintroducing ourselves in the program once again. So unless we have folks that are there consistently year after year, they pass on the message of the importance of ladders, SYP in their organizations, and they embed it in their funding, particularly around the fall. For large corporations, it's when they're making their final budgets for the following year and ensuring that ladders and SYP is incorporated. That's where we kind of see that some years we stay at the same numbers or even increase, but other years we do see some fallout with partners. So that's why we are continually, year after year, engaging new partners, re-engaging our existing partners, and that process begins in September.
Do you have an analysis of sectors and how it's done in each one? When we look at these, we see like my particular area is retail, there's manufacturing, et cetera. Are there areas that are hire more for the summer or able to, or?
So I would say for SYP, obviously retail is a big one. Some food service, not as much. And interestingly enough, I think in Ladders, we created, working with the Center for Youth Employment, we created verticals to focus in on specific sectors such as media, technology, real estate, and having that sector focus and working with individuals who have broad networks within those industries has really helped us a great deal.
So by sector, there's not one sector that's hiring less, or, like, I'm looking for the macro trend.
I would say where we struggle is really around healthcare, to be honest with you. That's one that we're trying to really break into, and there are various reasons for that. I think the age of the participants is one. There's actually, privacy concerns, but we still feel that there's a great opportunity there, and the majority of our letters for leaders applicants are actually very interested in healthcare. But when it comes to retail, obviously, summer camps, those are kind of like the engine that really fuel the sites for SYEP.
And that's stayed consistent.
And that stays pretty consistent, exactly.
And also, from a hotel standpoint, sometimes we get pushback from the union, so sometimes we get pushback from the unions because it always seems like they're taking jobs away from the regular employees, even though it's just a summer internship. So the hotels are very sensitive to that, and that's why we are trying to see if we can contribute financially versus the actual participants. But my only recommendation will be the program that you have for the 8th. Maybe you can let me know in the future, and I can see one of the hotels in the city can host it. I don't know if they have any cost associated with the event. Okay, but I can certainly talk to right now people about 30 hotels in the city, so maybe I can persuade one of the hotels to host it.
That would be wonderful, thank you.
Great, well, thanks, Reynolds. I think it's appropriate at this point to just recognize Eileen Alt. This will be her last board meeting, very sorry to say. She's retiring from Citibank. So thank you for all of your service, and thank you for the tremendous contribution to the summer youth program. We hope we'll have a warm handoff with somebody else. After talking about turnover, I hope that's all taken care of, Daphne. We got this.
We have very
Got a
strong
plan?
relationships with Eileen's colleagues, so we're hoping that we'll be able to continue the partnership. None of this would have really been possible without Eileen first reaching out and wanting to participate more and get involved in SYEP and Ladders for Leaders. So we are tremendously grateful for your support and your investment. So thank you.
Thank you very much. And if it wasn't for having the relationship with Daphne to get us started here, her leadership in that organization has been tremendous. And the work that you're doing for a low income is absolutely outstanding. So again, our city looks to make investments with municipal partners and nonprofit partners that are really high performing. And there's absolutely no question Leaders is in that category. And so are all my colleagues here at the Workforce Development Board. So it's really been a pleasure to serve on the board. And Chris and I are going to meet, I think, tomorrow and have a discussion. And we're hoping we'll have a nice person from my team, I think, as a replacement for this seat here. So we'll do a smooth transition. So thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you. So I think we're going to go straight from this to our panel. We have Liz Vladeck, who's Deputy Commissioner from the New York City Department of Consumer Affairs, and Irene Jor with the National Domestic Workers Alliance. And I think, Liz, are you going to lead off?
I think Irene is.
Irene is, okay. Irene, and please tell us a little bit more about yourself. And of course, I'm assuming you're going to tell us a little bit about the Alliance as well.
Yeah, Absolutely. So actually, Liz and I agree we wanted to kind of, first off, for those who might not be as familiar, kind of define who domestic workers are. So we're super clear. We know there's a deep interest among the board in discussing and talking about domestic work, paid care work, as it also intersects with the gig economy. So for the National Domestic Workers Alliance and our members, domestic work is an umbrella term that encompasses workers whose work sites are in employers' private homes. Often workers are performing what we traditionally categorize as reproductive labor. So the work that makes other work possible, that enables that employer and that family is able to go and also have their professional working lives. And this work often includes caring for children, cleaning, providing essential supports that allow seniors and people with disabilities or illnesses to be able to live at home and live in their community. And also many additional tasks and responsibilities that may fall out of those realms. From what we understand through our research, through our advocacy work over a 2-decade, 3-decade period at the Alliance, this is a workforce that is largely invisibilized. It's decentralized across many households, and for the larger part is socially isolated. And it's also a workforce that's so critical to the U.S. economy. And it frees up the time and attention of workers as described before. And it's something that we believe actually needs to be really part of every conversation because care is important to all of our lives.
So, good morning. Yes to everything that Irene said. I think our particular perch at the Office of Labor Policy and Standards here in New York City, we're a new office, and I'll talk a little more about us a little later, but within the office, a paid care division has been established. And so we have this term, paid care workers, which is essentially sort of artificial and made up to try and cover the universe of workers that Irene has described. And we're charged with doing work to strengthen standards for those sets of workers. My understanding is that this board has expressed interest in a discussion about paid care workers, domestic workers, and the gig economy. And so for our purposes, and as we discussed and prepared for the panel, I thought it might be useful to share, again, from our perch, what it looks like. Because we have a paid care division, and we have programs that are focused on what we think about as gig economy issues, and I would just like to define that a little bit for this discussion. I think there's a tendency when we hear gig economy to think independent contractors, Uber drivers, but in the world that I function in, it really, the term precarious work, I think that goes a long way towards encompassing what we mean when we talk about the gig economy. And so it's Uber drivers and handy workers and folks finding work on platforms, but it's also folks in precarious job situations. It's folks outside of the traditional 9 to 5 with a full set of benefits, job arrangements, as we watch the evolution of work. And so the relevance of that definition to this discussion today is that, again, our office has a number of initiatives underway to support home health aides, nannies, house cleaners, and those groups of workers share a lot in terms of demographics, basic job conditions, but the employment structures are really different. The vast majority of workers employed as home health aides are employed by big agencies, and that does look more like traditional, a traditional employment relationship, as Debbie will tell us when I get something wrong this morning. Right, and so for us, there's really a Venn diagram of paid care work, where we are looking at an entire universe of workers who have different kinds of jobs, but where there's a lot unifying them as Irene has defined it. Venn diagram of that universe and gig economy work. Because when we're talking about nannies and house cleaners who come to their jobs via a host of different methods, mechanisms, channels, etc., we do start to see more of the characteristics of precarious work, gig economy work, off-the-books work, irregular work, questions about status both as an employee or dependent contractor, documented as an immigrant or undocumented as an immigrant. A lot of the factors that make work less stable, less reliable, and less economically secure. So again, as Irene said, we wanted to start out with that framing so that we thought it was important for you to hear our working assumptions and worldviews before we then launch into who we are and what we do.
So again, my name is Irene, and just to give you a sense of how I came into this work that I do, when I was younger growing up, both my parents were in low-wage work as restaurant workers, and I became really sort of passionate about education as an issue, wanting to work in public school systems, thinking about how that gave me opportunity to really kind of move through life in a really different way. But while I was in school, and also during a year in which I did AmeriCorps, I found that all of the students I worked with, right, they shared a common issue where their parents were constantly facing precariousness as workers. And it really impacted what I felt like was possible to do in the school setting. And essentially, it led me to do work at the International Labor Organization. So it's the arm of the UN that does, sort of looking at labor relations and worker organizing. And so I went to Thailand and spent some time there with the ILO, and it was the same year they passed an international convention for domestic workers. So highlighting standards that a tripartite sort of conglomerate, right, of representatives from all around the world decided these would be the basic human rights standards we believe all domestic workers should have, that all countries should adopt. It was deeply inspiring, and it also made me, recognize that to have these big ideas, to have this set of standards, requires a lot of folks on the ground who truly believe in this and actually want to make it happen in their cities, in their states, in their countries, in their own homes, and in their workplaces. And so I was really driven when I came back to the US to actually work on this issue and connected with the California domestic worker movement. At that time, they were in their campaign working to win a domestic worker bill of rights in California that would close loopholes, exclusions that domestic workers faced from having basic labor protections in the sector. And so that campaign was deeply powerful, not just because of the energy, right, of workers really organizing and saying like, no, we deserve these rights, we deserve this place in society and this recognition. But I met a lot of employers who were in support of that campaign, and in particular, a subgroup of employers that came out for the campaign were leaders with disabilities in the community, and they were actually faced with the big debate around how can we afford this in the system, to raise these workers' wages, to provide them with overtime pay. Our hours will get cut for those of us who are able to have these services in our homes and our lives through public funding. But they really had their eyes set on and were in conversations with worker organizations about, no, we actually need to really transform the whole system. And workers deserve dignity just as we deserve the right to be able to stay in our homes and our communities, right? To be able to be with our families and our loved ones, to not be institutionalized. And so it was deeply powerful for me to see all the people that this campaign brought together. And it also made me reflect back on my life and do some digging and find out that so many of my family members have been domestic workers, bussed out from Chinatown in Boston to the suburbs as nannies, not being able to care for their own children in their own homes, right? But having to do this work in order to be able to attain economic survival. As I've gotten older, I watched all my grandparents age, and in particular my grandma, she's really suffered a number of injuries that she hasn't been able to recover from and does find herself in a nursing home. And my parents are not able to afford around-the-clock home care for her, and she does not qualify for all the types of benefits that might make that possible. Actually, when I first started working at NWA, when I visited home, I visited my grandmother and found her on the floor because she had fallen for 24 hours and not been able to get up. And when I reached her, I thought she had died. And there was a whole issue where her own home care worker came in for the partial day to support her. My dad would make up the rest of the hours of her personal time as a family caregiver, had her own family emergency where her own mother was hospitalized. But there was a disconnect between communicating that there was no one there at that time for my grandmother. So I felt deeply connected, and also as a millennial, I feel deeply connected to the issue of caregiving, to the state of domestic work, to the condition in which so many immigrant women are working in the sector, right, and face every day. And so I want to talk now about the organization I work for. It's definitely made a huge impact in my life, and I'm very much like, you had thrown out the word ambassador. I'm an ambassador for this movement. I really deeply believe in it. I believe I'll carry it for the rest of my life. So the Alliance was founded in 2007 by 15 organizations in 5 states. including those who are already undertaking campaigns to win domestic worker bill of rights in New York and California. We're actually now powered by 60 affiliate organizations, 3 chapters, 20,000 workers in 17 states. And we won 8 state-level domestic worker bill of rights from the years 2010 to 2017. So actually about 1 to 2 bill of rights campaign victories per year. It's in the next slide, so you can see what states have won it. Actually, one more slide. I'm going to ask you to go back. So these are the states in which we've run and won domestic worker bill of rights legislation that actually goes back and looks at where domestic workers have been excluded from basic labor protections, and also what are some industry-specific interventions that could support the sector look like. If you go back one slide. Our work at the Alliance now has grown beyond just running policy advocacy campaigns around labor protections. It still includes that, but we're organizing workers in various ways through various strategies. We've been on the forefront of not just bills of rights, but really looking at policy change and innovation on different realms. We have an innovations lab called Fair Care Labs, and through that we've been trying to think through what do private market sector interventions look like? How do we interact with companies like Care.com and or Handy? How do we think about workers and how they're represented in those spaces? How do we think about sort of mutual needs that maybe employers and workers might find that they share? And we're very much about building a bench of women's leadership that uplifts the voice of domestic workers, Black workers, immigrants, women of color, to really shape democracy in the economy. So our organization does a vast amount of stuff. But for us, we see ourselves, looking at both raising standards, but building a movement. So all women in low-wage work, feels the transformed power of what we do. So 2 slides. So Randolph had actually asked that I talk a bit about the historical context of domestic work. So the history of domestic work really is our U.S. history. So the earliest forms of domestic work started when European settlers first came to the U.S. And domestic work was not work by choice that people were doing. It was forced labor, and it appeared in the forms of slavery, indentured servitude, and over time, right, it kind of continued, and it sort of changed and shifted, reflecting how the economy changed. And so with industrialization, right, we see that more folks are entering the workforce, more immigrants are coming from different parts of Europe to come work in the US with starting families. And so we're seeing as cities are getting built out, as industrialization is on the rise, there's actually a whole new market for domestic work. And you can actually track back, you can look at the archives and see that. We also see after slavery ended, right, during the Jim Crow era, during the Great Migration of African Americans from the South to the Midwest to the North, that domestic work continued to be one of the few areas of work that African Americans could even enter the labor market. But we're also excluded from basic labor protections because during the New Deal, certain workforces and sectors were part of a deal where they were excluded from those basic protections because it was a concentration of Black workers. And so domestic work really comes from a legacy of slavery and racism. But over time, we see, with the rise of the civil rights movement, there's organizing for domestic worker rights along with civil rights. But we also see things continue to shift and change. And as the world became more globalized, we see influx of global migration. We see a lot of folks who've been fighting for various rights, be able to move out of domestic work. And so there's a huge shift in the US where domestic work used to be primarily a workforce of African Americans. But as they shifted on, we're able to move into other fields, experience upward mobility into the middle class or beyond, more access to other sectors as workers. It was continually filled in by other folks who actually stepped into that place of being sort of a next set of disenfranchised minorities, including poor immigrants and various types of women workers. And so there's a whole background and context that we've been tracking. A lot of academics have studied various parts of this history, but also parallel histories in other countries. And it's something to be aware of, to be thinking about. Especially for a place like New York City where immigrant workforce is so prevalent, right? And so important for us to pay attention to as we think about how we're developing our workforce. So it is one that experiences equity, so it's one that actually feels like we're really integrating them, right, into our American society, and we're really recognizing their full contributions. So next slide. So I want to talk a little bit about the characteristics of domestic work jobs. I think Liz said it best. She talked about basically it really varies. Like the structure of domestic work really looks different across the board. You know, for us, primarily our membership is made up of nannies or those who are providing childcare in the private home, house cleaners, and also home health aides, caregivers that cross over quite a bit with, you know, those in certain cities and states, those home health aides that are also unionized. And so, you know, what a nanny's job looks like really varies differently from what a house cleaner's day-to-day experience might look like. And you know, we're seeing that nannies and home health attendants in particular work really, really, really long hours, right? And those long hours actually, when you look at what they're paid, really equate much lower wages than they might assume that they're making initially, right? And you know, we find that folks are so overworked and don't have access to, say, healthcare. They're dealing constantly with various types of injuries, chronic illnesses, sort of harms upon their body that really come out of the work and out of the chronic sort of exposure to those same hazards on a day-to-day basis. We also know this work of caring for a human being is intimate labor and has emotional components, right? And sometimes it can be hard to navigate that, and or these workers are also doing various types of emotional labor, trying to support those families, right? When they're going through crisis, when their children are growing up and discovering new things about themselves, right? And needing extra support. Or you know, supporting a senior citizen to age and pass on and transition with dignity. And so we know that, you know, it can look many different ways. Many house cleaners and caregivers work pretty full-time, but of course there are folks who are working part-time in the sector. House cleaners, really, they continue to be the gig workers in the traditional part of the sector. It also ends up being the part of the sector where there's the most platform-mediated house cleaners, right, in the workforce. And I'll talk a little about that in a few slides. But house cleaners, they also really vary in what they're able to negotiate per job, per cleaning client. They don't have one single employer usually, unless they are a housekeeper, maybe live in or live out, and they work full-time for that family, keeping out sort of the household, maybe managing the household. And house cleaners tend to, you know, really hustle. You know, they're piecing together multiple jobs that are reoccurring at different levels, and trying to make sure all those things they're piecing together allow them to still take care of themselves and their families. And we see some house cleaners, you know, also overlap with the category of day laborers. So Workers' Justice Project is one of our affiliates, and they do some incredible work working with women day laborers, who essentially stand on the corner of communities like Williamsburg, and every day they wait for an employer in the neighborhood to come up to them and offer them a job on the spot. And this is a really difficult situation to be in. Some folks actually don't find enough work or make enough money that day to travel back home. People may be stuck in the rain, right? So we see a really vast spectrum of experiences workers face, but it's all on this sort of range of types of exploitation workers might be experiencing. And so, you know, we also see house cleaners that are actually really on top of it, and they figure out how to make this work for them. They may choose actually really of their own agency to do this work, so they have flexibility to maybe take care of young children at home, to be able to, you know, do all the things they'd like to do, to be very active parents in the school system, but also be able to make enough livelihood to continue supporting their families and their households. As a whole group, domestic workers actually tend to send a high level of remittances back home, and so they support the global economy. And some countries are super dependent on the domestic workers who've gone overseas to work and continue to do this sort of global financial support. So there's many differences between the three sectors that I've outlined. There's more emergent sectors of domestic work that maybe have smaller percentages, but also, you know, we see as being part of our workforce in our organization. There's huge differences between those workers who are live out, meaning, you know, in the morning they go to work, in the evening they leave and they go back to their own homes, and live in, those who actually live in their employer's home, and they may not just live in their employer's home and work some regular hours, they may actually be on call at any time. In addition to that, we see that there are differences between what certain ethnic and cultural communities are experiencing based on maybe their language ability, right, and the ability to communicate with the employer, to be able to access city services or advocacy-related assistance. Immigration pathways may actually really influence where a worker might land and how they access the sector, and they may be, super kind of directed towards the same set of bad acting employers that are sometimes part of the same network. And we also know that employment relationships could be good, they could be fruitful. The worker and the employer themselves could see themselves as a team, as a care team for a child or a senior, or have a sense of really trust and respect where they feel like they're maintaining the home together. And that is a professional relationship. So I threw this up here because it was one of the questions. It's actually a bit outdated, but it comes from our 2012 National Worker Survey that we spearheaded, and actually done a multi-year survey project in several metropolitan areas across the U.S. We trained organizers and worker leaders to go and do these in-depth surveys. So it was a community-based participatory research project, but we spent a lot of time doing analysis alongside U Chicago and the data center to really produce something that we hoped would support and did end up being in support of our Bill of Rights campaigns. But you can see that, this, even just looking at wages, median hourly wage, things really are different across the sector. And some folks are able to get sort of the higher end, right, of wages. And these are not high wages, right? Even I think at that point, they're still considered not living wages in most cities like San Francisco or New York City. But you can see live-in domestic workers make particularly low wages across all the sectors. And so the structure also impacts how well workers are maybe able to negotiate. And for most of the sector, workers are really negotiating on an individual one-on-one basis. And so that's something we grapple with in our organizing. And the reason we use legislation to try to raise the floor is because it does allow us broad coverage. But we see that legislating something is really different than actually implementing it in real life and shifting the culture where people want to put it into practice. So we're going to go to the next slide. So this is just an example of some of the rights that domestic workers have. For us in New York State and New York City, these are the rights that we often lead with when we're engaging new workers. We know for domestic workers to know their rights, there needs to be ongoing outreach and education. It's absolutely critical. We were very excited when the Division of Paid Care was legislated, which is housed in the Office of Labor Policy and Standards. We've been partnering to outreach workers in various creative ways. And not just workers to learn their rights, but to really get connected, to get integrated to some systems that can support them long term, that they can also develop as leaders in shaping and crafting. Looking at rights and raising the conditions of this work is one thing. Looking at how do we create tools and systems for improving employment relations is another. I'm really interested in thinking about how are workers involved in shaping what really effective training could look like that meets the mutual needs of workers, to have something that they can leverage that will support them to get the absolute best circumstance, right, when they are in their work, but also it meets the needs of what employers might be looking for. Because care work is not, we've often just looked at it as like non-work, but it truly is work. I think most folks who hire, they actually want someone they feel like, this is a person I feel like I can trust, that actually looks at this work in a serious way and is maybe committed to building the types of skills that ensures, that the things I care most about, what's most precious to me, is taken care of. So I can go to work, right, and focus when I'm at work. Sometimes workers just absolutely don't know. They assume as undocumented workers they don't have rights, or that they absolutely can't exercise those rights. They don't know that they can access paid time off or earn paid sick leave. They have no idea there's such thing as overtime pay. That's one of the biggest violations actually we see, and we see a lot of employers are also maybe unaware or concerned about how do I implement it. So we've been working through that. Workers may not know that retaliation is a real issue that they can actually hold an employer accountable to. So this is just kind of some sense of. Yeah, sure. So I am going to, if we go to the next slide, these are some sector-specific policy interventions we've either won and or we've been looking at and wanting to move forward. But I'm going to skip over this. You can look at this for reference later. You can see, we're really thinking very subsector specific strategies. So I want to talk a bit about the gig economy and platform workers. So if you actually, can you just go back to that last slide, Reynolds? So just taking the house cleaner sector as an example, this is a very simplified mapping of how house cleaners might be finding house cleaning work and connecting with that work on a day-to-day basis. And so most of the house cleaners we think of are the individual workers, right? That somehow go find these clients and are working and negotiating on a one-on-one basis. There's a pretty vast amount of workers that also go through companies and or agencies that then dispatch those cleaners. Some of them are offline, such as Molly Maids, employment referral agencies. Others are online, like TaskRabbit, Handy. There's also worker-owned co-ops. There's many in New York City, actually, and they've been really making a lot of headway trying to think about how they aggregate workers, right? And for those workers to negotiate a set of standards that they agree upon together collectively. There's other sort of forums like list or schedulers, individuals who subcontract out work. They start as cleaners, but they build enough clientele that then they hire other folks on a one-on-one basis, but they're totally in the shadows and they're not regulated in any way, and sometimes are also facilitating the violation of those workers' rights. Next slide. So the platforms in which we're finding cleaners are on, right, and other types of domestic workers are on, they're not a new thing. They're just sort of another iteration of sort of a third party that's facilitating the work. But because they're so unregulated, because they're able to disrupt sort of the sector in this way, we find that their practices from the outset are not very good, right? And they're really thinking, and I understand they're really thinking from this business perspective, and really, I think, ignoring what workers may need, ignoring that these workers who are maybe working significantly through their platform are actually workers. But we know that some of these are the issues that those workers face. So safety in the workplace, cancellation, and there being severe punitive consequences for workers, not having consistent schedules, and or the pay is much lower than expected, especially when workers don't understand under this current system. They currently may be classified as independent 1099 workers. Some are misclassified. They may not understand their legal rights and tax obligations or have access to actually making sure that they can file their taxes and obtain the right forms. Things like rating systems, which is a fairly recent thing, right, that we all participate in different ways, has also been set up in a way that can affect them very unfairly. And this kind of stuff is actually, it's just it's iterations and runs really parallel to what traditional house cleaners also face, right? They can be blacklisted, right? Very similar to the way rating systems affect on-platform gig workers. Employers can cancel, or they might cancel, and there could be severe consequences. Safety is still an issue for a lot of house cleaners that are actually, don't always know who actually is running the home that they're going into and working in, right? A lot of folks are taking risk, and so we organize these sectors all together, right? We're looking at very sector-specific strategies, looking at very particular types of ways that the sector is structured, and creating, strategies that we feel speak really specifically to these issues. But we also want to ensure that these workers see themselves unified, right, and thinking alongside each other, and sort of working through shaping the sector all together, and shaping the future of work. So it's not about one specific sector, part of the sector over the other. It's really, sort of about a strategy that is multifaceted, and that there's really clear lines of communication about how we're lifting up this workforce. So I will end there, and then hopefully, the things you're curious about, we can touch on in the conversation and dialogue.
Okay, so let me try to run through this quickly because I'm definitely very curious of what folks want to ask us about. So let me just say, the creation of our office is part of a movement around the country to try and take back some of the turf that has been the domain of the federal government for a very long time when it comes to workplace standards. And I get the irony of saying that, to this audience, but here I am. Now, what does that mean? Well, it means that not only are we looking at a new generation of minimum labor standards like paid sick leave, but we're also trying to figure out not just the what paid sick leave, but the how. How do we introduce laws at the city level, at the state level that start to raise standards again for workers? The law that creates our office makes reference to workforce development initiatives. And I would say that the primary way that our office engages with that concept is to try and actually make real laws on the books, right? A minimum wage job should be a living wage job, and so the administration has done a lot of work to contribute to Albany raising the minimum wage. All workers should have paid sick leave and other minimum protections that are enforceable and enforced, right? So that's what our office is doing. Our part of workforce development is making sure that jobs look like what they're supposed to under the law, and that the laws support a livable employment, situation for secure families. And so, if we could go to the next slide. Our office, part of this idea of not just the what but the how, is that we work holistically. And so we do enforcement. We enforce the city's paid sick leave and other laws, which I'll mention in a moment. We do extensive outreach and education so that workers know their rights. We have a paid care division that I'll talk a little more about. We refer folks to other agencies and sources if we're hearing complaints about workplace violations where we don't enforce that law. And we also do research and advocacy and policy development. Next slide, please. And we are a staff of about 45 and growing, which is made up of attorneys, investigators, outreach and education specialists, and research and policy analysts. And a lot of our model is based on working very closely with workers and their organizations, because at the end of the day, 45 of us are not going to make it to every workplace in New York City, right? And really the folks who need to know their rights and exercise their rights in the workplace are not us, the government, acting on workers' behalf, but workers themselves. And so we find that by partnering with organizations like NDWA, this is not only an efficient way to get the word out about what rights workers have, but it becomes a tool for workers to exercise those rights and for employers to get the information they need, another very active part of our program, to know what their obligations are under the law. So what are these laws that I'm talking about? Well, it's the paid sick leave law. As I'm sure many of you know, just this concept that workers are entitled to paid sick leave as a legal right instead of a benevolent benefit is like very young in this country. The oldest paid sick leave law in the books was adopted in San Francisco in only 2006. Right, so we really are part of something totally new in the country and in the society. And then these next two laws, I think, are among our most important because they really address very directly these new kinds of work that are emerging. We take the view that technology it has no positive or negative valence, right? It's a tool. Platforms are a tool, apps are a tool, smartphones are tools. The question is, what is the role that workers play in how those tools get used to shape their employment opportunities and situations? And so the Freelancers and Free Act is the first of its kind law, which makes it possible for the first time for independent contractors to really pursue their wage claims, their unpaid, when they're not paid for jobs that they've done. And I'll get to that a little more in a minute. Fair Workweek law is a new law that's only been in effect for 6 months that attempts to address a major role that technology has played in the fast food and retail industries, right? The logistics industry, which figured out just-in-time shipping in the last 10, 20 years, developed this model relying on technology that the service sector has looked at and said, oh, well, if you can use technology to time cargo shipments and inventory delivery so perfectly, why not use that for scheduling workers, right? If computers can give us algorithms that tell us exactly how many workers we need at noon on a Tuesday in June to serve hamburgers, like, look at those amazing efficiencies. The problem with that is that what it's meant for workers is that they never know when they're working or how much they're working. And so we've raised the minimum wage to a decent wage. It'll be $15 next year, $15 an hour. But if you're working 3 hours a day or 16 hours a week, that doesn't add up to a whole lot. Our commuter benefits law, grocery worker retention act, and living and prevailing wage laws are other ways that the city is trying to help drive up standards in sectors, low-wage sectors, where violations of the law have become a greater and greater problem. Next slide. And so organizations like NDWA have looked to government to, for the first time, really have a commitment to do something about standards in the paid care industry. And that's sort of, again, a made-up term, but we'll use it for these purposes. Because home health aides, nannies, domestic workers, cleaners, are immigrants, are women of color, are a huge workforce, 200,000 here in New York City and growing. You're not about to automate those jobs, right? But they are among the lowest in terms of employment standards among all of our sectors, and the rates of violations that they experience are among the highest. If we can go to the next slide, right? And so, because of these endemic systemic problems, the roots of which I think Irene articulated beautifully, advocates and policymakers have said, look, government's got to have some skin in the game here. Government has got to work with stakeholders and start trying to figure out a bigger picture, systemic change to how we treat workers who provide care. Because the reality is, I think most of us in the room know, is that we the middle class, we working families, we couldn't go to work, right, without people who were taking care of our children and taking care of our parents and taking care of our relatives who have disabilities. And so the concept of what the division is supposed to do is try to weave together all the tools we have, and hopefully some more we haven't thought of yet, both to enact immediate interventions into these industries, but also to start to change the way we as a society value this work, both morally and economically. And so we do extensive, right, so this is our most recent look at who paid care workers are. When we think about gig work, it really matters. As I said before, there's a stark division in the employment relationship if you're a home health aide versus a nanny or a house cleaner. And one of the big dividing lines is immigration status. You cannot be certified in New York State to work as a home health aide if you do not have employment authorization. And that operates as a really bright line, because when you think about where are there opportunities for training, skills development, where are there, as Irene said, where are there institutions where workers can engage and get support and mobilize and advance in their careers, that doesn't really exist still in any kind of systematic way for nannies. It obviously does in home health care. And so that line about immigration status really makes a big difference in terms of the opportunities that are available. These are numbers that we think really undercount nannies and house cleaners for exactly the same reason. When if you manage to reach someone who's undocumented, they're not about to talk to you necessarily. And so we know we're undercounting the folks who are working off the books. Next slide, please.
Liz, before you go, can you just talk about the end for the percentages, but is that out of 200,000 that you mentioned earlier? So 160,000 home care aides?
Right.
Okay.
Yep. So let's keep going, because I think Irene has pretty well covered the role that race and gender have played in the evolution of paid care work. Okay. And again, these numbers we think undercount, but it shows you that recent surveys we've conducted, which I'm not about to publish in an academic journal, right, but they're for our purposes, tell us that workers continue to experience really high rates of violations of basic rights. And if you think about it, both from sort of an interpersonal point of view and an economic view, how do you enforce, right? Think about a nanny in a private home taking care of kids. First of all, think about the relationship that woman most likely has with the kids. Whatever her relationship is with the parents, however well the parents do or don't behave, right? There's a very deep personal attachment that often forms. Think about how informal it is. There's no network. And so what we often find is that even among nannies who are, because we've conducted extensive focus groups to hear what workers are saying about conditions, even among those who have been in their jobs, nannies now, for a decade or more, even when they make a decent wage, $20 an hour, $25 an hour, they have no job security. right? They are always afraid that they could be fired tomorrow, and if that happens, there's no severance. They're often unable to collect any unemployment insurance, and so you could be talking to someone who's held a job for 10 years, which is uncommon in this economy, and there's still zero job security and zero expectation of continuing employment, or confidence, I would say. And so that dynamic, the fear of being blacklisted, it's all informal, you don't know what people are saying. That makes it very hard for the individual to go to an agency, to go to a lawyer, right? There's another dimension. When we do a paid sick leave investigation, we don't have to tell the employer who complained to us, right? If there are 20 workers in a workplace, we can just say, look, we need all the payroll records. We need to see how you're implementing this policy. If we're talking about one nanny in one household and I call the parents and I say, listen, I've got a complaint about your workplace conditions, I think the cat's out of the bag. So that's another barrier. Then here's another barrier. If a nanny makes around $30,000 a year, $40,000 a year, which is okay, right? And isn't getting overtime that they should get, what lawyer is going to take that case? Right? The economics of filing the complaint, spending all the attorney hours on the paperwork and the discovery, etc. The economics of it don't work, unfortunately. So all of this is to say that NDWA and other policymakers have passed a lot of really important policy changes in the last 8 or 9 years for paid care workers, including getting rid of the companionship exemption under federal minimum wage law so that it's now clear that home health aides are entitled to earn overtime. Wasn't before, can you imagine? Right? Making it clear that in New York State, nannies are entitled to overtime, they're entitled to days off. But how do you enforce these laws? How do you go into every single private household and start to solve the problem of the individual employment dynamic? And the truth is, and part of the relevancy of that to the gig economy is that that is the dynamic that you see with a lot of folks who are doing gig work outside of the paid care space, right? It's not regulated. Government doesn't see into what's going on. There aren't reporting requirements. People don't know what their rights are. And so it's all sort of happening outside of the frameworks that we have used to maintain decent standards of work, right? Including unionization. And so the fight in Seattle over whether Uber drivers can organize to collectively bargain if they're independent contractors is part of what we are looking at and thinking about. Let me say, if we can move a bunch of slides forward. Go back for 1 second. Let me talk for 1 minute about the freelance law, 1 minute about the Fair Work Week law, and then I'll shut up. With the freelance law, back to the same economic calculus for attorneys, right? Data is showing us that folks who do independent contracting work, gig work, regularly get stiffed out of the pay that they're owed for the work that they do. So if I'm an independent photographer and I do 12 or 15 gigs a year, and that all adds up to about $80,000 a year for me, that's not bad. Except that if I don't get paid for a $5,000 gig or an $8,000 gig, that's my rent for 3 or 4 months. Well, so what do I get to do if that happens? Well, I can go to court. I can go to New York State Supreme Court and file a breach of contract claim. Who's going to take my case? Right? Breach of contract cases, lawyers don't earn money for that. They get a third of whatever the worker gets, usually. They make their own arrangements. So there has not been a pathway for independent contractors to recover the monies they're not paid. There's no governmental oversight. It's not wage and hour law where the agency comes to investigate. And so workers go without pay. That's just what happens. This new law, which has been on the books for about a year, says that if you are doing independent contract work in New York City for more than $800, and that can be over a set of jobs in 3 months, you're entitled to a written contract that specifies the terms of the work that you're doing. And that can apply if you're a house cleaner, and it can apply if you're a construction worker, and it can apply if you're a photographer or a journalist. And you're entitled to timely payment. And if the terms of your contract are violated, you are entitled to double damages on the total value of your contract, You are entitled to your attorney's fees, so guess what? Now it is worth lawyers bringing these cases. And you're entitled to penalties if you face retaliation. So that all sounds really good, right? But in my world, it matters what actually happens when you pass these policies. We are like beside ourselves with excitement that after 10 months of this law being really in effect, we've recovered $250,000 for about the 250 workers who filed complaints with us. And what mattered to me the most, was most striking me about this, is that this is in cases where nobody went to court, nobody filed a complaint, nobody launched an investigation. In most of these cases, the only thing that happened was that my office sent a letter to the hiring party saying, there's a worker here telling us they didn't get paid. What do you have to say about it? That's all it took. And that is really telling to me because it takes me back to this question of the employment that is happening outside of the framework where government has a role to play and where parties feel like somebody might pay attention to whether they're following the law or not. I was really struck by how quickly there are companies that I know have excellent relationships with unions on behalf of their regular employee workforce, and just were doing things with their contractors that I knew didn't sync up with their corporate culture. And the minute they heard from us, they fixed it. So this tells me a lot about some important directions for us to pursue. The last thing I want to say, and I'm sorry to take so long because I really do want to get to a discussion. If we can move forward to, keep going. One more. Great. Actually, the next one. Thank you. So again, I mentioned retail and fast food workers and just-in-time scheduling and the way that this is wreaking havoc on the lives of these workers. And here's the way I want to relate this to workforce development. You know, auto jobs, mine working jobs, steel jobs, these used to be crummy jobs, right? 100 years ago, these were really, really crummy jobs. And then workers organized and made them good jobs. We have a habit of talking about fast food jobs as like the bottom rung of our economy. These are after-school jobs that high school kids get to earn some pocket change, except they're not. It turns out that there are a lot of workers for whom fast food or retail is really a career, whether they intend it to be or really want it to be or not. And in fact, what a lot of the discussion has been in the last several years is there's no reason you can't make these jobs decent jobs, right? Automation, let's just table that for now. But so what's been happening is, I'm sure you know, is that there's been a movement to raise wages in those sectors in particular, and more broadly for low-wage workers, where again, violations of even minimal rights are endemic. And so the wage was raised, but the scheduling was irregular. So the new laws we have on the books in New York City, they've been on the books for 6 months, that my office enforces, say that in fast food and retail, workers are entitled to advance notice of their schedules. They're entitled to premium pay if their schedules are changed. Employers cannot keep them hanging on call so that they don't know when they're going to work. They are supposed to have good faith estimates of how much and when they're going to work, and those estimates are supposed to get updated. And to me, that is the ultimate workforce development program. Oh, and one key element, particularly in fast food, part-time workers are entitled to bid for additional hours. Before an employer says, I've got a vacancy, I'm going to hire somebody new, can't do it until you offer those additional hours to the current workforce. So there is a mechanism in place for a part-time job to become a full-time job. Doesn't impose additional obligations on the employer, it's hours they would just give to a new employee. Doesn't require the employer to give extra hours to a worker if that tips the worker into overtime. It does create a path from a part-time to a full-time job. And so to me, this is the ultimate workforce development program because it says stable employment, decent wage, and the ability to do other things like go to school at night, right? Or plan childcare so that my partner can go to school at night or try to get a better paying job or whatever it is, have some control and some choice. So that's a lot of stuff packed into, you know, too much time probably. So thank you for your patience and eager for a discussion. Thanks.
Thank you. I mean, obviously, this is an incredibly complicated topic, and you guys have done yeoman work on helping us at least start to dip our toe into understanding some of the complications.
various sectors and different kinds of labor arrangements. I'm sure there are many questions all of us have, but I'll open it up. Just go ahead, yeah.
So could you explain to me the current employer's obligation from a like tax standpoint of hiring? Like if you hire a nanny full-time, aren't you obligated to like issue them an I-9 if you pay them more than $600 or whatever? I guess I'm like some of that doesn't. Okay, can you just?
Yeah.
Okay.
Sure. The law is the law. There's no question about it, right? There are tax requirements for any employer and any employee who are in a traditional employment-employer relationship. And it's not really, from the law's point of view, me as an employer saying, you know what? I'm a contractor and I'm contracting with you. You're an independent contractor. Well, good for me for saying it, but that's not what determines the status of the relationship. So yes, in an employment-employee relationship, which is going to be most household nanny relationships, there are tax obligations and employment documentation authorizations on both parties.
But they're just totally.
Then there's reality.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know what more I can say about that.
Lori, you had a question?
Irene, you referenced the,
Could folks wait for the mic to arrive?
Sure.
People are trying to take minutes.
Okay, sure. You referenced the Domestic Workers Bill of Rights, but didn't really explain what some of the key things are in there. I think for our purposes, kind of hearing what policy recommendations are and thinking about, are there some models out there that you think are good models? Like, for example, the Freelancers Union has invested a lot of energy into affordable health care for freelancers to participate in a way that helps to drive down the cost by aggregating purchasing power and creating a larger base of participants that could make costs more manageable. The same might be true for training or other kinds of workforce development. The Workers' Justice Project has a cleaning cooperative. So especially for immigrant workers thinking about other forms of organization where that organization, whether it's a co-op or some other kind of organization, has access to things that individual workers may not, that people could participate in regardless of immigration status, language, or other things. I think for our purposes, thinking about, recommendations and ideas or models that we should be looking at, I think would be really useful.
Absolutely. Reynolds, you can go to the slide that says policy interventions. It's a two back from this one. Yeah. So each of the Bills of Rights in the different states actually really vary because the state labor laws across those states, actually domestic workers start at a different place. So that's something that we're actually going to address with the federal Domestic Worker Bill of Rights, which actually may still not actually exceed what some of the states offer, right? So that will take long-term work to get all domestic workers up to a standard we feel like, nationally it should be the case, right? No matter where you work. But for us, the Domestic Worker Bill of Rights, through them, we've actually won inclusion that sometimes it's not just like the first time this workforce is included, but maybe a section of it was excluded. So the New York Domestic Worker Bill of Rights, in a lot of ways, wasn't winning like overtime in New York. Domestic workers already had overtime rights, but most didn't know or didn't even have the concept of what overtime was. The idea that they had in their mind and that employers maybe further reinforce is, you work as long as I need you to, because I'm just paying you this block amount of money. And so the Bill of Rights campaigns actually are times when we're actually educating workers on the rights they currently have. We're doing wage theft enforcement work that you can already access. But we are also seeing where, there's some deep exclusions. And we found that, I think, in our Bill of Rights campaigns, like live-in domestic workers actually do not have the full access to say what live-out domestic workers in some cases have. And so, for example, live-in domestic workers didn't have access to the sexual harassment discrimination protections at the state level. That was one from the New York State Bill of Rights. So even just like legislating and saying like, in the law, we know that this is wrong, that live-in domestic workers who are actually maybe even more vulnerable to that type of treatment, right? Because they have no access, or much less access to the outside world to be able to report on things like that. But this chart shows some of those things. So, we've been fighting for, and New York has really set the stage for like, paid sick leave, and us wanting that in many places for domestic workers. Minimum wage, overtime protections at the federal level, but sometimes at the state level are things that we still need to win. There's some things that are really industry specific. Many domestic workers, when they've convened in the lead up to a domestic worker bill of rights campaign, when they've had their conventions and talked about what we needed, they talked extensively about needing meal and rest breaks, really clear times where they could take a break and take care of themselves, but also maybe being able to cook their own food in the home, right? Because they can't leave the work site often if they're actually providing sort of uninterrupted care to an individual. Advance notice of termination is something that we fought for in most of our bills of rights, but only was one in Massachusetts. It's a very hard one to deliver. It's a very debated one. So we're seeing in Massachusetts in particular, their bill is incredible. It's like the upper standard in which we're aiming for. They also actually included the right to maternity leave, where the worker could go back to work after, right? That they didn't have to face the possibility of the employer deciding termination. That there could be an agreement, an arrangement would be made. There's also a requirement for written contracts in the Massachusetts Bill of Rights. But actually, they had more of a foundation to build upon to get to that level of a Bill of Rights. The New York State one was really focused on education around existing rights that domestic workers had and building in more inclusions for live-in domestic workers, and also building in paid time off. So workers can accrue time off to take care of themselves is preceding paid sick leave, right? So between the state law and the city law, domestic workers in New York City can get the full 5 days, but even domestic workers outside of New York City can get it 3 days in a year. So that's some of what we've been able to get. In Oregon, we did win the right to the use of kitchen facilities and the right to cook your own food of your choice, right? To not just be forced to eat what the employer might be handing you. And for house cleaners, there's a large hole there. And part of it is house cleaners are not often, in most cases, not classified as W-2 employees and have rights to our traditional labor framework. They're still part of the gig economy, even if they're in the more traditional parts of domestic work, but they have no access to OSHA protections. OSHA excludes domestic workers outright. In addition to that, many of the civil rights, human rights discrimination laws have a particular threshold where you have to work in a certain size employee setting before those things kick in. And we know discrimination or harassment actually happen quite often, quite prevalently in domestic work. And workers really, in many cases don't have access to that law, right? So even knowing that, like, in society saying that, you deserve to be protected from these things. Our organizations, worker centers, worker-owned co-ops have been trying to figure out how to collectivize worker voice, how to aggregate their ability to be able to bargain together. So worker-owned co-ops is incredible. There's such a wonderful network here in New York that are trying to figure it out. And they're able to maintain a level of standards that go beyond the basic rights that workers are afforded under the law. There's a network of at least 13 worker-owned co-ops that I'm in contact with, and we've been trying to figure out how to actually get them all streamlined so that they may be sharing the same level of standards and they see themselves as stewards for improving standards for the whole industry, right? Not just for their co-op members. In our worker centers, some organizations run hiring halls, and they negotiate with employers directly the standards that workers will take when they get matched to a job, right? So actually doing the more high road end of what we see some of the companies and the agencies doing and the platforms doing. But it takes work, right? It takes people capacity to build out the structures. Right now, they're very small scale. One project that we have to actually try to build out the infrastructure of workforce training for nannies is a 6-organization cohort that is trained up a network of 60 nanny trainers, along with a partnership of the Worker Institute of Cornell ILR and also the Consortium for Worker Education. So it's a 7-part nanny training program Our organizations are now equipped to actually run their training in-house in 3 different languages directly, English, Spanish, and Pali. Our hope is to train up many workers to also across the network get to a wage scale we feel is fair in conversation with employers and government, and essentially when workers graduate from the program to attach that standard and to begin to build some of that system and infrastructure. We don't know what it will look like long term, but we begin to set up the model where we think training can also lead to a more collective system for raising standards. On the national level, you know,
Nora, I'm going to ask you just to stop for a second so we can try to get a few more questions in before we run out of time here, just in case anybody else has other things they'd like to ask about.
I have another question.
I'm going to ask one first then, since you're going on your second. Liz, where do employers fit in? To what extent are you working with employers? Are you thinking about how to organize them around industries? Or is there any thought to certifying sort of high road employers that would give both consumers and potential workers an idea of which companies really were the ones to look to?
Yeah, so our approach with employers is similar to the approach we take with worker organizations, which is we want to follow employers' lead. And so we do extensive outreach and education with employers, and we do it in whatever way employers want to do it. So we will go from, you know, large summits of employer side law firms and attorneys and in-house counsel, workshops and trainings, to sitting in the lunchroom of, you know, fast food restaurant, training the managers on the new timekeeping requirements. When the Fair Workweek laws were launched, we did business education walks in every borough and personally delivered the new required employee notices to, I think, something like 1,200 businesses. You know, I wouldn't deign to suggest to employers or in any particular industries how they ought to organize themselves. Instead, I'm more interested in what our office can do that's helpful to them in terms of understanding and being able to follow and comply with the new laws. If you look at the website, our website, we have developed extensive tools. We get it that, you know, the laws we enforce are, as I said, they're totally new. You know, there's not case law on the books in the country about how do you apply paid sick leave, how do you apply Fair Work Week. And so if you look at our website, we've got template employer forms that relate to the different requirements. With paid sick leave, we have a pre-programmed Excel spreadsheet that you can just pull off of our website, an employer can, that will track accruals for you of your workforce for paid sick leave. So, you know, Mark, to answer your question, it's a little bit of ping pong, but I guess we're most interested in what employers, you know, can use from us, what they need from us. And we try to answer that call whenever we get it and make sure the word is out there in the world that we're waiting for it.
All right, I guess you're...
I'm up again.
Yeah, Mike.
Thank you. That works. Okay. So you were showing how home health care aides are
82%.
Yeah, and then we had a presentation where they were talking about how home health care aides were largely through agencies and often subsidized or paid in full by Medicare.
Medicaid, yeah.
Medicaid, sorry. And I guess my question, I think there's this part of me that's okay, what would be, in the, blue sky, if anything's possible version of this? Is that kind of, what's a structure that could work? Can we learn something from how home health care aides like that?
Yeah, so we're in the middle of an initiative. So paid sick leave's been on the books in New York City since 2014. Home health agencies are consistently among the highest volume of complaints we get about compliance with paid sick leave. And so what we find with home health care, and back to similar and different from nannies, the employment structure is so different, right? And so there's a ton of regulation, especially because Medicaid is involved, and there are fraud issues and financing issues, and it's federal dollars and state dollars. And so there's extensive regulation. What tends to be missing is the part where workers who are in the private homes feel connected to know what their rights are and how to exercise them. Now, I'm of course describing non-union agencies, right? It's obviously a different situation where workers are organized. So on the one hand, there are advantages to the employment relationship when there is the agency role. And in fact, 1199 and others did tremendous work getting the wage parity law adopted about 6 years ago, which is sort of like a prevailing wage model for home health aides, right? It says a minimum hourly rate and a benefits package that's at least worth $4.09 an hour, or monetize that if you're not going to provide benefits. So the standard is there. The enforcement of that standard is really still a challenge. And I think some of that relates back to that individual private household dynamic we discussed earlier. In my view, and Debbie, you should weigh in if I'm getting it wrong, but in my view, some of it is also about, the focus of long-term care and home health care has been, as it should be, on the consumer client, the recipient of the care. Right, and so there's a ton of regulation around the financing of the care, the payment of the care, and the quality of the care. What's been missing is treating on an equal footing the treatment of the workers. So while there are ways that the structure of the agency relationship makes it easier to raise standards and do enforcement, there are really serious gaps as a practical matter for workers.
All right, Amy, one last quick question, quick response to here, Amy.
And I'm going to, it's going to be an easy one to answer. What is the living wage currently? The last time I looked at it, I was told it was $11.80, but New York City.
All right, so it's posted on our website, so shame on me for not, it's $13 and 95 cents. Right, now unless somebody passes new legislation, it's gonna stay there. So next year, when the minimum wage is $15 an hour, the living wage will be $13.95. So I think we've got some work to do.
Great. Well, thank you very much. It was really a very interesting discussion. We're going to turn it back now to board discussion. Our last two meetings have focused on various aspects of sort of the gig economy or precarious paid care occupations. I'm going to hand it over to Chris to sort of lead the discussion on how the board might respond.
Thanks, Mark. And to sort of tie back to the last meeting as well, I think we had a really great presentation, engaged conversation like today about specifically workers' ease online platforms. And two things came out of the last meeting that we want to follow up on today. Number one, the board identified a desire to launch a pilot program of some sort. And then number two, the board indicated some interest in seeing what the board might do as far as either influencing or educating the administration about options for protecting workers better, either limited to online platforms or perhaps beyond. So a couple updates there, and then we'll get into a conversation here. So in terms of the pilot, we are just finalizing the last couple of details around the source of funding. Joe McDermott has graciously agreed for the Consortium for Worker Education to cover either some or all of the cost of the pilot program. So Joe, we really, really appreciate your generosity there. I think the board also talked about at least a tentative focus. We have a small ad hoc committee that is working on fleshing this out, but there was a conversation about targeting workers that have already chosen to be to focus their work on online platforms. The board felt uncomfortable sort of encouraging people to enter it knowing all we know about it, but if people have already made that choice, I think domestic work, or at least home-based work, was also identified as a prospective focus. It might not be limited to domestic work, it might also include handy people, but all mediated through online platforms. And the idea was, could we provide a relatively short-term training for workers who may not even see themselves as entrepreneurs, but essentially are running small businesses? And if they're low-wage workers, is there a relatively short and cheap training we can provide to help them increase their online presence, market themselves differently to increase their incomes? So that's still moving forward. We just got to work out the funding. And then in terms of policies and the laws to protect workers, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that our board chair, Larissa Arroyo, was concerned about the board not overstepping its bounds into lobbying and advocacy, which may require certain registrations, and WIOA has certain provisions. But I did speak to our legal counsel, and we can certainly have a conversation about it. And then the question remains, what can the board do about it? What does the board want to do about it. And we are waiting for a response later this week from the law department about what we can and sort of cannot do. But we are definitely not prohibited from having a conversation, and this is bringing this all back, which is, hearing what we've heard. What does the board want to do, or what do we want to know more about? Are there elements of protections for workers that the current law maybe doesn't provide, other states we want to look to? And are there things that caught your interest today from the presentation that we, the board might want to further and perhaps raise with certain folks within the administration?
So I guess maybe, one thing that comes to mind for me is, so some of, I think, the missing piece of this is the individuals having the knowledge around what the rules are and what their rights are. And in trying to think about how we can affect change or help that. The Workforce One sites, do they do training around what a worker's rights are or how that could work for them when they enter the workplace? And is there an avenue for us to encourage or somehow assist in that?
It's not a primary, apologies. It is not a primary service, but we have in the past piloted certain efforts to inform individuals when they go into the gig economy of how they can sign up, different avenues, etc. But it has not been a primary service in the past.
Does Workforce One do work with domestic workers?
Yeah, we have worked in primarily home health aides in the past, but that's been our biggest area of foray into that.
Maybe I'll put you guys on the spot. So, Ada and Amy, you had expressed particular interest in learning more about the current laws that exist that protect workers. From your perspective, has this presentation sparked anything about what you think the board could or should do in terms of either learning more or taking a stand?
I really appreciate that you took the initiative to have the presentation, because a lot of this was, the last time we met, it's sort of hard to remember, but there are all these questions about, sure, there are these gaps, how are they being filled? And I think this answers, I took notes because there are a lot of things I did not know that New York City was doing, new offices, new laws, etc. It's going to take a bit for me to sort of process and think what, a next step is. But I do think, knowing the breadth of what's there, I do think, I'm wondering whether it can be added to our purview or our numbers in terms of if the gig economy is getting bigger and things are going that way. And it seems like we have these sort of more private organizations that are doing the function of unions. It's essentially becoming this whole employment area. It's a shift in employment to this gig thing, but it's not getting counted in some of the things we do. So I'm thinking, in terms of not expanding our jurisdiction, because I know it comes from the federal government, but having this be part of what is in our purview. Do you see what I'm saying? Because it seems like what we're doing maybe in some ways is getting smaller to the extent that this is. Okay. Yeah.
Hi. As a guest, one of the big issues I think everyone realizes is, are these people really employees from the gig economy, or are they independent contractors? And are we seeing people who really go to a job just bringing themselves? Like bringing a car with Uber, are they really their own businesses, or is this a way of having workers not get any rights like Social Security, workers' comp, etc.? So I was just interested that the state of Massachusetts just passed a law that helps to define who is an employee and who is an independent contractor. I don't know whether the city could do anything would have the ability, or would have to be a state change. But I think that's a very key thing. And so Chris, when you were saying like educating people about having their own businesses, just to be aware that if we are supporting that someone who's making this very low wage and is not really an independent contractor, is their own business, I don't know if that is the way to go, you know. But I congratulate you and the board on having this discussion, because I think these are the new issues and how to support this workforce through these rights, but also something that we really haven't discussed that much today about training of the workforce and creating career pathways and credentials for people. I think is a very, very important and something that we could set a national model on here in New York.
Liz, can I just ask you, do you have any response to Debbie's point about what's within the city's purview to do?
Sure. So the question of are you an employee or an independent contractor is specific to a particular substantive right. You know, you can't adopt like a for all purposes you're an employee or you're an independent contractor. So when we enforce the paid sick law, we take a pretty expansive view of who's an employee. Now, we need judges to uphold that view and establish it in case law, but it's definitely something we're exploring with respect to all of our rights. In addition to which, with freelancers as a first step, but with our city human rights law and other new laws, we're trying to figure out how to start to make the distinction between employee and independent contractor less relevant for economic purposes, so that the scales kind of even out in terms of not only what you get if you're classified one way or the other, but what the incentives are to treat workers as independent contractors or not. Right.
And then Lenore, go ahead.
I might be wrong about this, but there are different tests at different levels depending, because there's a federal test, multi-factor test for employee versus independent contractor, and it's interesting. That kind of dovetails with what I was saying in terms of like not having these strict categories anymore, right? It's work,
Right.
right?
Right.
So that's
And
really
it shifts with the political lens.
there's a state test, and then there's, for some purposes, a city test, or no?
So the state test exists in application of the wage and hour law
Right.
or other laws, right? So in construction, when the state adopted the Construction Fair Play Act, it was to push back against what had become systemic misclassification of regular construction workers as independent contractors. So for example, for construction workers with wage and hour law, there is a presumption that a worker is an employee unless proven otherwise. So it becomes industry specific, standard specific, and it goes back and forth depending on who's the judge and who's the governor and who's the president.
Right.
Lenore.
A suggestion might be to take a look at the recent city legislation passed to protect construction workers and mandate training, including providing funding for worker centers to provide, in the case of the construction industry, they provide training on OSHA 10, the OSHA 30, safety since construction work is so dangerous, or can be really dangerous without proper safety precautions. So, you know, looking at something that's appropriate for this industry or these industry sectors, to think about what's the kind of training that might make sense, you know, whether certification or a certain amount of hours of training should be required, and then providing the funding available so that people can get that training, including supporting existing organizations, worker centers, unions, or whoever else, you know, may be able to provide that kind of training that raises standards and helps make people aware of what their rights are and have a different sense about themselves as workers and employers in terms of what their responsibilities are as well.
I had a couple of thoughts. One, I've mentioned at the last meeting when we first were getting into the gig economy, and it follows up on Scott's suggestion. I think this should be a no-brainer for the system. Is we should, at all the one-stops, have as part of the orientation
a presentation on the gig economy and what any job seeker needs to know, right? Because there's not all negative, there's plenty of positives, there are lots of things that are advantageous about the gig economy, especially for new job seekers. But there are negatives as well, and we have 120,000 people coming through the one-stops.
Absolutely.
That's a great opportunity that if we think this is important, we're just missing.
No, absolutely. And to tie in and actually go back to your point is and I'm sure individuals like Jackie Mallon and Kevin coming to attend this and kind of reiterate the point, we consider ourselves a demand-driven system. So most of those types of conversations are on the business side of things. So we look at which businesses does our system work with in terms of certain levels of quality. So we try and use our resources to work with businesses that are at least offering full-time hours, over 30 hours, consistent, as well as paying at least a living wage. But that's not to say that absolutely it's looking at the gig economy. It's something we should look at how we can use those resources.
Right, we support all of those things, but not all the people coming into the one-stops are going to depend solely on the one-stop to get a job. They're looking for work in lots of different ways, and the one-stop is just one of them. And this is something where we have 120,000 people a year. It doesn't take long if we keep doing it each time.
Yep.
For the population we care about, to be aware of what the issues are. And I think the same thing, Daphne, on the youth side. I mean, we need to have these things sort of happen like right away, not, still stay at the next meeting. We have almost as many young people coming through the system for the summer youth employment. Part of the orientation can be, looking at who participates in the gig economy is the younger workers who participate much more than older workers. So, that's a great opportunity. The thing that, I just want to raise, and we can't address in the immediate term, but it just comes to me from this conversation today is, what does the board think about some way of recognizing the high road employers? Those who are meeting these labor standards, those who are, adopting the new laws that are coming into place. How can we certify them as places where, as a consumer, I can know this home health care agency is certified by the city as, having done all the leading practices related to how they treat their workers, or as a child care agency or a house building agency. So it starts to reward in the marketplace those companies that are doing things the way they should, and hopefully penalize the companies that aren't. So we're supposed to be an employer majority board. I'm not a for-profit employer, but it just strikes me that that needs to be part of the conversation. And we're, if not us, who's going to lead that? Go ahead.
I have had experience with one thing like that, which is the Best for New York campaign. Did anybody? Yeah. And only one concern I have with something like that is the big companies are in general always going to be able to get that certification. And I'm not sure it's weighted for smaller, medium-sized companies as well. It's not sort of scaled. There's only so much you can do. If you're, Whole Foods, which is now Amazon, there's a certain breadth of, shareholders, et cetera, not making, you can appear to be a really good employer in terms of benefits and stuff like that.
Right.
For a smaller, medium-sized employer, it's just, I feel like it's slightly different calculus. What's interesting is, I've been in business now for 14 years, and we were ahead on all of this stuff. But now, every time a new law comes in, I'm like, okay, we got to comply. Oh, we've been compliant for 14 years or whatever. So, we're, in terms of standing out, it sounds strange, but we're kind of getting eclipsed because all the standards are being brought up to what we were. Yeah, so I'm not, I don't have a recommendation, but I'm weighing in with, it's challenging,
Absolutely.
And for small and medium business, I think even more so, because we don't have the economies of scale that allows us,
I think this speaks to, and this is where I have a concern about what the role of the board is, which is something we've touched on, but it still isn't totally clear to me. But I think the struggle for me in these discussions is I'm not opposed to educating the worker, but I just think that I'm not saying that we're putting the responsibility on the worker to advocate for their own rights, but I think if we do that, if we only do the education piece to the exclusion of trying to advocate for better regulation and enforcement, I think that in our actions we are doing that, and I think that to me, it's great if someone knows their rights and helps, sort of agitate for them, but fundamentally, you shouldn't have to know your rights to not have them, horrendously exploited, which is what's happening. So anything that we can do within the bounds of our purview to advocate for enforcement, and I think I would really like to participate in.
Great, and seeing that we're short on time here, what I would propose there is that we continue, that we have a follow-up meeting to discuss, you and Amy were sort of part of that, the sort of worker protection, Joe as well. And if there are other members that would be interested, we certainly would love to have more members participate, but I think we could convene again to discuss what are some of our interests as far as potentially promoting certain things that are currently gaps in the law, or certain protections where we're falling short and we could do more. Does that make sense? Val, I'm sorry, did you have a
I was
question?
just going to say, I said ask Liz and Irene for what we, how this board could support their work. Are there specific kind of tasks or requests? Obviously, that may have to be vetted, but do you have suggestions for what this board could do to support your work?
Tell us what you need from us. The idea of our office is that we are supposed to be a resource to workers and employers and the public. And so when it comes to workforce development, part of why we haven't launched a big workforce development initiative is because you're doing it. You're doing more than we are. And so we have developed a ton of material, trainings, we have staff ready to be deployed, but it would be extremely helpful. We've got Worker Bill of Rights that you can stick in your pocket, right? We've got 50,000 of them that we can get anywhere you want. If the one-stop centers are a place where that's a useful piece of literature, we'd love to bring deliveries. If there are trainings we can do at the one-stop centers, if there's research our office can do to support the initiatives of the board, the point of what we're here for is to be a resource. So tell us how we can help.
I think for me, I'm really interested in, actually how do you bring workforce development and enforcement agencies together and embed some of the strategies. So there's training, there's building, really healthy employment relations, not just on an individual one-on-one basis, but how do we aggregate, say by neighborhood or by certain entities that interact with an aggregated force of workers and employers. How does it tie, it can tie together. And for me, I think with training, a lot of our members don't see themselves reflected in what training is offered and can't access it because of language, because of immigration status, and this is a huge problem. And so we've been building the programs, in a separate world, right? And trying to find ways to fund and sustain and scale them. I'm really interested in what can be done in the centers as an intervention, as a site of intervention that encounters so many workers. So, Mark, really interested in what you were pointing out. But I think beyond, for us, I no longer just do know your rights education. It's know your rights and then what next, and how are you then responsible for supporting other workers, right? And being able to screen them automatically, do issue spotting as a lawyer might do, and feel that responsibility. So it's hard because it's beyond the worker and workers together. But I really would love to see what is an investment in domestic workers as a workforce look like in the formal systems, for them to be talked about, spoken about, and included in a real way. And essentially they should be able to go to a center and find that there's programs that fit them, and also know they're not only getting trained in skills for domestic work, that they're getting trained in transferable skills they can use if they move out of the sector, which many people do, and have gone on to do various types of other things, including being program officers for foundations. I've heard of some workers who, through the employers, actually make personal connections. The commissioner of ACA used to be a domestic worker herself, and now is a prominent lawyer and leader in our city government. Even Greg Bishop, who's on this board, his mother was a domestic worker before studying and becoming a nurse. And I'm not saying that's the story of all domestic workers, but our workforce really has some real skills. And I think what's important is more than training and rights education is that in that training and rights education, their sense of the norm is shifted, and also they are able to strategize differently and given the best strategy for how to navigate the system, how to navigate potential career pathways and grappling with the conditions of their work. So not just on, okay, how am I classified, what do I do next, but how do I make the most of this job and make it really as robust work as possible, and then look at the options beyond it. And I think that takes time and a lot of stakeholders to come into conversation to design something like that. But I think it's absolutely worth it. This is where we're moving. We're actually a little bit late to the game, but we're still at the table, right? When the conversation actually really needs to be happening beyond sort of the thought leaders and academics.
So we're at 10:30, or maybe just past. I want to first thank Liz and Irene for devoting so much of your time to be with us today. It's been a really terrific discussion. I think we've all learned a lot. So. And obviously this is a topic that will need to be revisited. But on that note, do I have a motion to adjourn? A second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
All right, meeting adjourned. Thank you, everybody.
I don't. I'm like the worst at this. Okay. I'll get your email.
Good to see you.